How's everybody? Welcome, welcome. Lots of familiar names. If you just want to drop your name and where you're from, even though I suspect you all know each other. Hey, Lori. Hey, Max. Oh, hey, Mary. Lisa. Awesome. Hey, Megan. Got the Perry Sound crew. Hey, Carol. Hey, Prakash. Cochrane. Awesome. We got a bit of our Alberta folks. Cool. Strathcona County. More than a little bit of Alberta. Hey, Jessica. All right, we'll give everyone a couple minutes. I was told twice that we have perhaps too much content for an hour, so we're gonna do our damnedest, but we'll get going here in a second. County of Wellington, hello. Hey, Jessica, nice to have you. Hey, Jennifer. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Matt. I'm Jessie Donaldson, EVP of Strategic Services. I know many of you through the previous NASDA and AMO project, an OMSA project we did, Municipalities Under Pressure, where we asked you for a whack load of data. So I'm still saying my sorries and thanks for that almost a year later, but appreciate you guys joining us today. I've been thinking, obsessing over these 10-year housing and homelessness plans for the last I don't know, 3 weeks on where we've come from and where we're going. My background's in housing and homelessness. I was part of the COH and Homeless Hub back in the first pit count, 2016. And so I appreciate the time and the space to talk this through with you, and also have my colleague Matt here. He's going to bring us some of the kind of socioeconomic trends that I think that are important to consider when we're building this plan. I'm going to then move into a bit of an analysis of the minister's directives that came through in the letter to update the 10-year housing and homelessness plans. For those who are not from Ontario, I know there's a couple of us. Minister in August put down a directive that all service managers in Ontario are to update their plans, housing and homelessness plans, by May. And this conversation is to look at sort of the evolution of where plans have come and where we want to go. I do think it's relevant beyond Ontario, though. Some of the signals Matt is going to show you are related to our economy sort of writ large. And then I'm going to show you how provincial and federal movements are quite similar to what's happening other places in Canada. So with that, we will try to get through all 45 slides. If I move quickly, don't worry, we're going to send you the PDF after. Matt, I will give it to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. So for those who haven't met before, Matt Parker, I lead the tech and data arm of Help Seeker, and background's more in AI, healthcare, life sciences, but huge data nerd, and so try to apply that here. So like Jesse said, most a chunk of you actually participated in this and led parts of this project, but just to kind of level set, um, a little while back, we produced a report with AMO and all the municipalities to project out what homelessness may look like, all things being equal. And so, starting with kind of the 2024 data, an estimated 81,515 people were estimated to be experiencing homelessness. And as you can see from this chart here with the projections, uh, by 2035, up to 294,000 people could be experiencing homelessness, all things being equal here. Or maybe it would be steady or an upturn scenario. But really what we want to dive in a bit more today is there's so much great data out there. The challenge really is working through the narrative of it and getting it all together in one place. And so in this case, we use kind of a economic upturn, downturn, or steady state. I was going to go through kind of the socioeconomic and demographics of this in a bit more detail and what current trends are telling us and how this is kind of modified to date. Next slide, please, Jesse. So, I mean, we all read the news, you all hear all the doom and gloom around the economy and all that stuff, and not just in Canada, but worldwide. But what's interesting to me is once we actually dig into the narratives, there's a lot of these important trends that are suppressed or hidden that really give us a ton of information about how demographics of homelessness or housing struggles might shift, and also what's happening more generally. And yes, we will send out a copy of slides after this. So, looking at kind of the macroeconomic or Canada-wide statistics, we have the quarter two economic statistics. There's a bit of a lag, but quarter two is not too bad. And what we saw was a negative 0.4% contraction of the GDP. And so you'll kind of see a trend as I go through this data. That's not spread equally. There's so much discrepancy in how the economy works for different people, how, even rental markets work for different people. And it's really important to dig into kind of the why and the how and make sure we understand the data we're using. Because it's kind of that dichotomy between on one side, it's there's so much, what do I do? How do I use it? On the other side, so often it's reduced to a single sound bite, which might be misleading. But this is a great example in, small contraction it looks like, but for certain parts of the economy in Canada right now, they're really being hammered by the current US uncertainty, the trade war, the tariffs, all that stuff. And so what we saw in Q2 was a 7.5% drop in exports. And so municipalities, regions that depend heavily on manufacturing and exports are disproportionately hit by the current state. Next slide, please. And so what does this mean? Because it's interesting. I think during COVID, post COVID, there was so much coverage of inflation and wage growth and everything there. But actually, when we dig into these numbers, and especially the recent numbers, this is way more telling. And so some of you might have heard a lot of the coverage of our current inflation isn't that bad. CPI or computer or consumer price index is at 1.7% and it doesn't seem terrible. But altogether, what we're seeing actually is much tighter kind of real purchasing power or ability to spend. And so, yes, CPI is 1.7%, but that's in one part suppressed by transportation and specifically gas prices in the past 12 months going down. But over the past 12 months, latest data we have is for July, food went up by 3.4% and shelter went up by 3.0%. And when you tie this with looking at Ontario, only a 0.1% wage growth, it's getting really tight where inflation is still here, it's still getting very expensive, and wage just isn't keeping up. And so it's easy to kind of look at the aggregate statistics and see, oh, it doesn't look too bad. But as I said, as we dig more, you'll kind of see the trend here. Next slide, please. So I know most of the folks online are from Ontario. So we want to focus more on kind of the Ontario specific use case. You can do a lot of this actually with all provincial or all provincial data and municipal data where available. Um, but really, it's the same method. It's just kind of going through the data and walking through that narrative. And so if you look at Q2 projections, which is what we have on Ontario, released, I want to say late August, Ontario lost about 38,000 jobs. And so overall, that may not seem like a big number, but you got to remember this is also a net statistic. So certain sectors actually added a ton of jobs, other sectors lost way more than this. And so it can be a bit misleading just to look at job loss. And even though we only have Q2 data for this, Statistics Canada publishes what's called the labor force survey. And so we have data from July on that. And even post Q2, we're seeing job losses in Ontario continue. Next slide, please. And so the other thing that's really, hit the news these days and is a worry for many people, and I think we've all heard people searching for jobs and really struggling, is unemployment. And so if we look at the latest data we have, which is July, unemployment is trending up overall. There was a dip last month, but overall it is trending up, especially from, pre-2024. But as you can see here, Ontario actually leads the pack in the current unemployment rate. But once again, this isn't a statistic that's really felt equally across our society. And it does signal a concern, but it also signals kind of demographics and people who will struggle more, and then also gives us the opportunity to target more interventions toward them or kind of get ahead of these trends. And Jess will go into much more depth about that, but I'll kind of do this from the data perspective. Next slide, please. So what's interesting here is we actually can get a decent amount of data on the CMA level, which is one of kind of StatsCan's aggregations. And if we look at the top 20 CMAs by population size, and then we plot left to right from highest to lowest unemployment rates, you can see how unequally unemployment is felt right now across kind of bigger municipal regions. So, for example, Windsor is running, somewhere around an 11% unemployment rate in Uh, I think this number is from July, and that's from January, or sorry, August, thank you. Um, January, this was about 9%. So that's a massive increase. Some of these cities are feeling it way more. Some actually gained jobs overall, and unemployment went down since January. And so, really, all these statistics need to be taken with a grain of salt because just because something looks strong or the economy in certain areas doesn't seem weak, that doesn't mean individuals aren't really struggling. And we actually have a fair bit of data to really target this in as we go. Next slide, please. So if we kind of go back to the Q2 Ontario numbers, what's interesting is they actually plot out by CMA once again in Ontario, what are the job changes or employment changes that have occurred. And so once again, this really highlights how easy it is to suppress these narratives, these demographics, and what they go through. And so, as you can see here, once again, Windsor shows up strongly. Rationally, this makes sense. Windsor depends heavily on manufacturing, specifically auto, and auto has been one of the worst hit among tariffs. And so, this makes a lot of sense. But there's actually the ability to really continue this story down and figure out, even though the only monthly data source we might have up to date would be labor force survey, we can actually take that down pretty granularly based on communities and how this might affect things. And especially with kind of the job losses we're seeing, these trends become more and more important. Because once again, remembering that 38,000 job loss in Q2 alone, Ontario is a net figure. Manufacturing had the biggest job loss by 10,000 jobs. That means the number two sector for job losses lost 10,000 less in manufacturing. And this was in Q2 when tariffs just started. What we're seeing kind of from labor force survey and other kind of more timely data sets is this is continuing. And with all the uncertainty, this could all change tomorrow. But at the same time, this is good data for us to kind of get ahead and understand who is disproportionately affected by all these changes. Next slide, please. The other one that's interesting right now is unequal unemployment pressures. So same graph as I showed before with unemployment rates. But once again, it's so important to understand that these are not spread equally among sectors, among demographics, among Canadians as a whole. And so a great example here is in our AMO report, one of the things we found was newcomers, refugees, and asylum seekers were overrepresented in the homeless serving system. Well, we know that the government's trying to reduce various ways of immigration from temporary foreign worker permits to education visas. And so that might reduce things, but we're actually seeing other trends that likely will either kind of fill that gap per se or make things worse. Next slide, please. Now, anyone in the audience who has a child in the 15 to 24 range, and we all know people in this age range, we hear a lot of and gloom, and really it is approaching crisis levels. So on the bottom in those dashed lines, what you have is the 25 years and over unemployment rate. And on the top, you have the 15 to 24 years unemployment rate. So yes, Alberta's worse than Ontario right now, but Ontario's still running a 17% unemployment rate for this age group. To make matters worse, this is a harder age group to analyze because unemployment really is a statistic that really only looks at people who have jobs or are searching for jobs. If you've gone back to school, if you're not looking for jobs anymore, oftentimes with this cohort, school is a big kind of draw when it's hard to find a job, or moving back home with parents so you can survive is more common. And so the participation of 15 to 24 is lower than the general population. So it's not 17%, it's 17% still in the market looking for a job, don't have one, but likely there's latent demand of people who have just left because they can't find anything. And so this is an interesting kind of change in demographics we may see with people really struggling with housing is if it has this level of unemployment and you don't have safety nets in family or other groups, you're likely going to be disproportionately affected, especially with kind of a weaker economy and expensive rentals. Next slide, please. So the other one that always I find interesting is starting in COVID, income inequality I think really does hide more the economic story of what's happening in Canada right now. And so in this graph, you have what's called quintiles. So essentially, it's 20% of the population. So when you see lowest quintile, it's the 20% of the Canadian population that has the lowest income. On the right, highest quintile is 20% of Canadians with the highest income. And so this is really widened disproportionately for a variety of reasons. But in the blue, you can see is household disposable income. So that's between 2019 and 2024. How much has disposable income in this case increased? And in yellow, you have how much has inflation or the price of goods increased since 2019 as well. And so in the lowest quintile, cost has increased faster than income. The other thing that makes this problematic is 2019 to 2024 includes COVID, and government transfers are part of income. So you had unprecedented levels of government transfers that have now been wound down that people no longer have access to as well. So the story could actually be much worse for lowest quintile earners. Meanwhile, the highest quintile or highest earners in Canada have had massive increases in income and not as much increases in cost compared to income. And so what this does, because this is, both of these buckets, lowest quintile and highest quintile, represent 20% of the population, the high income suppresses it. And so when you look at that average, you don't see the whole story of lower earning Canadians are really struggling today. And especially when wages don't cover the increase in costs, we have unemployment rising, it becomes more worrisome. Next slide, please. You can also see this when you actually look at interest rates and how disproportionately they affect Canadian. And so tons of coverage 2023, 2024 when we hit the ceiling of interest rates. But in actuality, we have a really big delayed effect here. And so there's kind of three factors that are going on right now. One is people usually, older people who own their houses closer to retirement have larger retirement savings. This is a huge boon because alongside kind of higher interest rates, there's been massive investment returns. But if you're someone with a mortgage, there's a number of mortgages still being renewed at higher rates in the next 12 months. So even though the rate is lower than it was in 2024, um, it's still very painful to go from, let's say, 0.7% interest rate to 6% interest rate. And so you have people encountering expenses that they never had before for housing with mortgages. And then finally, you're getting people who don't have mortgages, renters who are getting more squeezed. Because in many cases, one of the main things you can do in response to higher prices is take on debt, and debt is more expensive these days. Next slide, please. And so you can actually see this when you map out some of the non-mortgage types of debt. So the bottom two lines on this graph are people with mortgages. And as you can see here, it doesn't seem like a massive increase, but what arrears is you have a debt that you haven't paid, you're 60 days late in paying essentially. And so it's going up. Is it at historical highs? No. But especially with so many mortgage renewals still coming, this could likely go up. We're just kind of waiting to see how the data shakes out. But what you can also see is those top two lines, which is the auto loans and credit card debts for people who are renters who don't have a mortgage. And that really has risen rapidly. And as I said, debt is becoming more expensive. And as I've shown before in these slides, things are more expensive and income isn't keeping up. So a response to that is debt. And debt is just making things worse. And people are skipping out on bill payments to afford things. Next slide, please. Even if we just look at kind of rental information, it can be hard to parse kind of fact from fiction. And so before moving out to Alberta, you'll have to forgive me for that. I live in Toronto, was in a 480 square foot condo with my wife and my dog. And I thought back then that would have been 6 years ago, this can't be sustained. Like it's just too much for this small of a unit. And we see a lot of data now coming out and saying, there's more vacancies, housing prices are going down, especially condos are going down in price. But that doesn't actually mean necessarily that renters are A, going to feel that immediately, or B, even feel that at all. And so even though vacancies are rising, rent burdens grow. And so if you look at the CPI or rental costs, um, they still are going up over time. We've not seen kind of a drop in rental costs at an aggregate level, even with kind of a weaker housing market in Ontario. And a great example of this is in 2024, in some cities, new tenants were having rents 40% plus higher than previous occupants. And so, especially with mortgages being more expensive to carry and people being tighter who own the properties, more and more is trying to be pushed onto renters. So no longer is it that kind of we have these outlets necessarily, but because there's these economic pressures, rentals aren't getting cheaper right now, even though we're seeing all this coverage about condo issues. Next slide, please. So Is it all doom and gloom? You know, I don't think so. I think what we're seeing really is more of a nuanced perspective of what the data is telling us. And so, yes, growth is cooling. There's so much uncertainty in trade and the world in general right now. And it's a challenge for trade exposed Ontario. When we break down kind of the basic necessities like shelter costs and food costs, we see them continue to rise. And the food banks have done some great research and produced some great data on how people really struggle with food these days. And it's the same with rentals. And Ontario in particular is being hit really hard by trade issues with the US and with youth unemployment being at 17%. Um, Honestly, once we consider kind of that cohort going back to school and the such, honestly, we're probably approaching more like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. And so while we have high income houses pulling ahead, low income households continue to lose ground. And we're seeing that in the debt data, we're seeing that in the income data, and there doesn't seem to be a reversal of that trend. But what this does give us is kind of more targeting, more insight. And Jesse's going to get into more of this in a moment here, but we all know there's increasing fiscal pressure. We have to do more with less. There's an urgency. People are struggling. What can we do? And so if we really want to respond to this and do more, I'm a big believer in using that data to find out what targeted programs would be helpful here. So if it's youth unemployment, is it that we can do a more effective targeted program at a lower cost and intervene with that cohort more? And there's also an opportunity to scale based on this data too, because there's also much more of an economic case when you have this data behind you to say, here's what we're seeing in the data, here's what we're projecting out, here are the trends that we're following, and your case becomes much stronger. But I'll pass it back to Jesse here, who will go into much more depth about the policy.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I think the conversation Matt and I had was who is likely to become homeless and what are those drivers? And really Matt used a phrase that I hadn't thought of before, but economic homelessness. And so anyone on this call who's been in this for a bit, you know, we're watching three things: inflow, the number of people coming into the system, system performance and system optimization in the middle, and at the end, that exit outflow. What I'm confident about, and you will be too over the last few years, is we're not going to optimize our system out of this. As I'll show you, we have seen a growing number of people getting stuck in said system. So while that's incredibly important, and I think needs to be business as usual as far as plan development, I think what's dictating, not only from a socioeconomic, but also a political lens, what may dictate these next plans is our ability to increase faster, build more, increase exits. And that takes a different, I think, type of planning than some plans have applied previously. So provincial priorities. So we have a copy of the letter, of course, from Minister Flack, and I wanted to go through the priorities and talk not just explicitly about what they say, but I think some implicit signals, if I was a betting woman, implicit signals I can see in it. And so one is going to be deliver more homes faster. And we've been hearing that for years. Anyone who's on LinkedIn can see that that's really accelerated in part by some of Carney's pre-budget pushes on the budget submission. So core government message you can see in the Ontario one is accelerate supply. One, we saw the modular factory built, which I think was the second thing on the list, which I think is interesting. But nonetheless, there were three mentions throughout the letter of building faster, signaling performance expectation. There's an implicit performance expectation, invisible units in the pipeline. Good to see, happy to see, but we know that this is not without significant cost, is the deep affordable housing and the non-market supply. So happy to see that there's not an assumption that private market rental or developers are going to be able to kind of fix the affordability crisis we're seeing. And frankly, I've seen that in some localities, not just in Ontario, but in sort of some councils across the country of this idea of, okay, affordable. Private market can handle that, 80% of market rent. But when we look, market rate, when we look at the stats that Matt's showing and the stats that I know you know well, not meaning to mansplain, is that won't help us on the deeply affordable end of the continuum. We are not going to get rents back in a lot of deeply affordable housing models to supplement some of those upfront costs. So it takes an entirely different planning model, financial model, and also I think advocacy model with both province and feds. Mixed income housing similarly, so that's interesting. Again, it's a duplication of the focus on non-market supply and mixed income housing across that full continuum, focusing on what I say is the left, so that homelessness side veering into that deeply affordable side prior to getting to private market rental and homeownership. And then protecting community housing stock, and that's huge. And I'm fortunate enough this year to work more with the Housing Services Corporation and learning about just what state of kind of disrepair the community housing stock is, and the differences of relationships between service managers and different housing corporations, and how that's really going to impact the success or tension of your plan over the next 10 years. Next, no surprise that we saw the public safety concern piece stay, but there was something I think interesting. So prevention is mentioned, prevention is framed, but it is through the lens of appropriate alternatives to encampments. To me, there's an implicit suggestion here that a performance measure will be the visibility of encampments, a number of encampments, a number of people you have, and your prevention efforts are in part measured by that encampment piece. And if you read the sentence, it to me is really deliberately constructed. And so we're going to keep that community safely public order tone to homelessness for at least a year. And I'm going to talk about how data is your best insulator in some of those paradigm swings that we use to apply to homelessness. And then supportive housing integration. No, makes total sense. Of course, we're going to keep substance use and recovery. The focus on that, not just from the province, but the great need, I think is important. However, how we actually integrate with health-led plans, I think is an interesting opportunity. And if one of you are doing that or thinking that or going down that road, I would really like to learn more. We also know that there's federal signals that are already starting to kind of bleed in, particularly on public sector. And when there's public sector corrections, when there's conversations about the size of public sector, how much we're spending on public sector, those will go from federal to provincial to municipal. They will go all the way down. And I expect you'll see them in the municipal elections in Ontario next September. We can already hear rumblings of it. When there's that kind of look at the organizations who are delivering this, what comes part and parcel is an expectation of outcomes for investment. And I don't want to say do more with less. I think that's not quite it. It's about demonstrating that there's proportional outcomes to investment. And we can, I think in some ways that can be unfair. However, that is simply the climate that I am positive your 10-year plans are going to exist in at a local, provincial, and federal level for the next 10 years. That I think is a gimme. But at the same time, there is this expectation that we will build infrastructure, but it will be tied to clear outcomes. And so I think that's a more challenging environment, frankly, to build a plan within and build a response. But I also think it's an opportunity that serves what I assume is everyone's goal in this room, is to make progress on ending homelessness. Of course, the last one, but again, really important that it was mentioned, was the alignment with provincial planning statement, of course, which pushes the whole plan, the whole alignment of the housing and homelessness plan into a planning paradigm. So housing target, which gives you housing targets, your land supply obligations, complete community, your zoning. I think it was really interesting to see how the housing accelerator funding went down from communities and was sitting in usually totally different departments than the service manager, human services, operations. And I get why, but the marriage, this and along everything we said, is going to sort of require what I'm suggesting is a slightly different marriage for how we govern and implement and develop our housing and homelessness plans. All right, here's what's behind this. I'll cover it a couple. The sequencing of priorities is deliberate. It goes housing, 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 little bit of homelessness, encampments, data. That's the order of the letter. That's the order of the intent. And I suspect that's the order of priority and funding you'll be in for the next several years, as far as province goes, but also to federal. Affordability and preservation are given unusual specificity. So that's good. That's important. Like I said, homelessness prevention is articulated through the prevention of encampments, which indicates prevention, very tertiary downstream prevention, but it also indicates that encampments are going to be a focus and a continued performance measure. This one is really interesting. By name lists are mentioned. They're about midway through the letter, and they are mentioned not as an indicator of progress towards or performance of managing homelessness, ending homelessness. It is mentioned as a tool to connect people to services. That's a shift. By names list, of course, we've invested a ton of energy. It's great in a lot of ways. It gives us the data we need, but it is being used in some communities as sort of the indication of performance. Later in the letter, about 4 bullets, 3 bullets down, it talks about data again. So again, disaggregated from that by names list mention. And it says collect, share, and report on data to monitor progress. The distinction between by names list tracking and that last bullet, my bet to you is that is going to indicate a greater onus on service managers for sharing data, collecting, reporting on it to monitor progress. And specifically, it mentions monitoring progress of how people are moving through the housing continuum. And then, of course, housing supply is the overarching frame, fast and more. So I looked at plans. I said, all right, where all of our kind of previous plans, and there's a lot of them, so I only picked 10. How might these previous plans serve our current context? One, Matt's context that he's laid about the socioeconomics. Two, what's happening in provincial requirements. But three, my experience living in a community and seeing what communities and families and individuals are facing. So I don't need to go through this again, but 3 concepts: inflow, people coming in; homelessness serving system; scale, performance, mix. We spent a lot of time over the years in that middle. And then outflow. We can't outflow people unless there's places for appropriate, dignified places for people to go. When we think about plans, even in Ontario, where some of the money and some of the mandate is devolved to the municipalities, which is unlike other communities, most other communities from a provincial and municipal level across Canada, these are challenging because the levers you have, and as a DSAB, to actually impact results are really not equal. I don't really think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, municipalities can address inflow meaningfully through the homelessness sector. We do not have enough money. We do not have the mandate within the homelessness sector to massively change upstream prevention. I just don't believe it. I do think it's important. I don't think it can be done through your mandates. So things like population growth, economy, social assistance, etc., even vacancy rates, health and justice policy, you can't control. So unfortunately, not unfortunately, but just the reality is your plan really needs to sit at the nexus of what's our response, because you have a high degree of control over that, or you should. And then what's our influence on where people can go. And we've really, plans have sat more in the middle, but a little bit more on that exit response. But which way the wind is blowing on both provincial, federal, and socioeconomic requirements are that we've got to shove our resources, our expertise into that. How do we build more sustainable exits in supply? This is, of course, from the data that you provided. Again, thank you. It was incredible learning. I think this is the clearest picture of why we need the exits. And I'm preaching to the converted, but really we all in 2016, I think it's about roughly 20%. I can't really tell, people experiencing homelessness or experiencing chronic homelessness. Now we've just hit 50. So 2024, we estimated 50% of people who are sitting in the system are experiencing chronic homelessness. 25% of youth and children are experiencing chronic homelessness. That's not right. That's a system failure. So what's happening? Are systems not functioning? Probably that's not the reason. It's because there's too many people coming in and there's not enough appropriate places, exits to flow. Okay, so I'm gonna go through, what's my timing? Yeah, I have way too many slides. We're gonna figure this out though. So I'm gonna go through kind of the evolution of the plans, and I would love for you to kind of challenge me, or maybe I'm thinking about it differently, but I think if we think about what they were for and think really hard about what they need to be for over the next 10 years, how you might move in the next 8 months may be different. So 2012 CAH, there's a plan, not a dream. I pulled it up. I was looking at it. And it was really a declaration of you need a plan to end homelessness. Someone in the chat here. Does someone have a... Okay, awesome. So it said set the national playbook. So a shift in thinking, and it was homelessness is a systemic issue. It brought in housing first. Homelessness is a housing problem. It really focused on the idea, though, that you could coordinate a system and to manage that inflow and outflow. Then we had local plans and frameworks. So the first wave of Ontario's 10-year housing and homelessness plans, that was significant. Anytime Ontario, you guys do things as a bunch as service manager, it has big ripple effects across the community. We saw it with homelessness the country. We saw it with homelessness and housing plans. We saw it with community safety well-being plans. So what you did so many years ago had huge impacts on the trajectory of how we manage and respond to housing and homelessness. Those plans largely focused on coordination, by names list, coordinated access. That was also if I'm dating myself, with the HPS mandate at the time from the federal government. Getting our house in order, organizing our closets, making sure people are moving, making sure that the crisis response is acting as needed. And I think that's had huge impacts in how you're operating your systems today. Good impacts. Then we have COVID. We said screw 10-year plans. And I know, frankly, when I can see it, a lot of you didn't bring back your pre-COVID plans because they're ridiculous at this point. So we went from kind of 10-year goals to 10-day responses, and the work that all of you did within that was incredible. So used really, really agile planning to respond to kind of a huge humanitarian and logistical need. So phase 5. Now we have a directive to update them. What's the theme? Maybe it's obvious and maybe I'm wrong. I would love to talk about it, but I think it's exits at scale. So systems coordination, coordinated access, data, shelter standards, all of that is kind of table stakes. Effective program mix, program performance, have to do that, needs to be in your plan, part of your job. But I think the new challenge for these is how do we build appropriate, dignified, and sustainable housing at scale so exits are real? And what part of it is your part versus the provincial government and the federal government, community partners, and what does that look like from an implementation standpoint? Coordination can't substitute for the supply, and I think it's about bringing a new system together, which some of you are doing, frankly, and then you're all at kind of different spots. And so if I'm saying what I'm saying is obvious, that just means you're further ahead. So I went through the housing plans. I did 10, and I can see 3 groups ish. So one is the housing builders. And about 3 of the 10 I looked at, kind of different size communities in Ontario, had 70-80% of a housing focus and 20-30 homelessness systems coordination. System coordinators were kind of on the other end, and that was more common. So more focus on systems coordination, community collaboration, which I'm all for, don't get me wrong. And then we had a couple that I think were more of a balanced hybrid. So examples of supply-focused strategy: zoning, new construction targets, development charge, homelessness, housing first, by name, shelter diversion, HIFIS implementation. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm suggesting that we think each at a service manager level and on Ontario level, which needs our focus, and depending on our focus, who needs to be in that room when we develop it. But the most interesting thing, and my caution, and frankly, HelpSeeker over the years has drafted some of these same plans, is even when there were targets or for new spaces or reductions in the housing plans, there were no costs. And I know why. I know that getting something to council with cost and approval, that's a really difficult challenge. But there wasn't even a discussion of what costs might be. And I think the risk is if we develop these plans in absence of an honest conversation about the costs, then they're just pipe dreams. It's really easy for you to go to council and say, hey, do you want to approve 1 million new supportive housing units? Great. Yes, I do. It's a much different conversation. We say, this is what it's cost, and this is what the outcome we think it has in our community. And more importantly, if we don't do it, this is what we can be expecting in our communities and for our families and for the builders. So new foundations. What do I got? Okay, I got 20 minutes. I was going to do this presentation differently, and this whole idea of governance and data and design took up way more than I thought. And so I'm looking forward to having additional conversations with you on the youth lens, the health lens, public safety lens, climate change. I got a lot of thoughts. But I'll spend the next little bit on the design of the plan and how you may move through updating it. And I think one of the questions I have is if we are moving from target-based, cost-based, housing-based plans, if you believe me that we need to push towards that, then in the development of the plans, we need to put equal weight or considerable weight to the internal change management and buy-in for the plan before it ever gets to paper. And generally, and I've been part of those plan developments, that we focus on external partners, which are excellent. That's who's interfacing with people experiencing homelessness. You need those partners, but it's the internal mechanisms where we have the housing development, or that we have the homelessness plans being developed without the knowledge and understanding of the other departments. So I think there's three, but there's more. Finance is of course one. Planning and development, political leadership, that's obvious, but depending on the size of your municipality, there might be many others. Whole corporation accountability. I think the opportunity is in a lot of organizations for you to look at the whole corporation. If you're a DSAB or a consolidated service manager, you've got a whole other ball game you have to play, working with other municipalities within this. But the department that drafts the homelessness plan you can't be the only one accountable for results. It's not how it's supposed to work. You as a service manager, a legislative responsibility cannot possibly be solely accountable for the targets that I believe and the province believes, and frankly, you believe we need to set in order to exit people from homelessness. So don't get stuck in the corner with your plan and these targets without everybody around you saying, yes, we also buy into these. But your role is to make sure finance, planning, development, infrastructure, and council have the data, knowledge, and interest to act. So if you can walk into your planning department and say, hey guys, can all of you define deeply affordable housing for me? If you can walk into any counselor's office and they understand why the private rental market isn't appropriate or going to work for the inflow of people experiencing homelessness, that's a win. If you can walk into your finance department and they know that with deeply affordable housing models, there's not opportunity for rents to come back to cover the upfront capital. If they understand the different ways they can use financial instruments at a municipal level to build, that's your win. And so my suggestion is, and through that experience with a few municipalities, is build that part into the development of your plan. So governance built into the development plan, not bolted on after. So don't go explore our governance model for blah, explore blah. See how much you can push up front, because it's going to be a heck of a lot easier when you get to council. Shared definition of deeply affordable, I think is really important. Everyone should get it. Everyone should understand why deeply affordable and homelessness supports are essential in the community. I do believe there needs to be whole corporation alignment. Depending where you are in your journey as a municipality, you may need to increase the formal accountability mechanisms. So delegated authority, separate boards of senior leadership to work on that. And don't create a bureaucracy for no need, but don't get stuck with this housing plan that you don't have the mechanisms or the levers to deliver. I'll just skip through here. What I would do day one, build a deck and a roadshow and shop that thing around. So what's the macro socio and economic trends that are impacting your community? What's the continuum with the barriers and the opportunities? How are people experiencing it in your community? How much is needed? What are you going to build and why? Or what do you need to build and why? What are the costs and what are the consequences of an action? It could be 5 slides. But if you start to have those conversations regularly internally across the DSAB or corporation, you'll identify where there's kind of barriers, but you'll also be able to identify where there's allies. All right, I'm gonna keep going. Boom. Next, agile implementation. 10 years is sort of a joke. And if we look back on the last 10 years, how much of things have changed. So of course, what I would recommend is you set your direction for 10 years, but then you create annual objectives off of that. Agile planning, it's a different kind of, it allows for more nimbleness than waterfall planning. So my suggestion is build this right into your plan. Create annual objectives with the specific outcomes you need to achieve off the back of your 10-year plan. There's nothing in the provincial directive that says you can't do that. Every year, sit down and build that backlog. Get that finance department, get that planning department, get them all in the same damn room and build all of the possible actions, projects, investments, etc. you need to achieve those annual objectives with clear roles and accountabilities. Then reprioritize quarterly. Get back in that room and say, okay, well, this is the announcement from the federal government. Oh, the provincial government has changed direction on here. We had a crisis in our community. We need to change direction here. Reprioritize and relook at those backlogs. So are the annual objectives the right ones? Which backlog items were completed? Which were stuck and who were they stuck with? Which backlog items should we pull forward to keep momentum going? And then what do we need to add next? I also would suggest designate a plan owner that's a senior leader who has the political capital, social capital to move barriers to backlog items. So if Bob and planning, I don't know why I'm picking on planning, Bob and planning is stuck. Bob's never getting his thing done. It's impacting 7 other people. That person needs to say, okay, how do we remove this? Or how do I go to someone who can? The next thing I'll say, okay, 15 minutes. The next thing I'll say is define your customer. And this wasn't my idea. It was someone very smart. I worked with a partner, one of your colleagues who's a service manager. And they had mentioned we can't have a strategy without knowing our customer. Who are we serving? And customer may feel like uncomfortable language, but it's not if you're committed to a service culture. That as a municipality, as a service manager, we are serving a base towards a positive social outcome. We're serving our community. When I go through all the plans, more than the 10, sometimes the customer is clear and sometimes it's a mix. So people experiencing homelessness, our most vulnerable homeowners, people in core housing need, priority populations, low and moderate. That's all fine. You can have multiple customers, but you need to know who you're serving, to what level, how many people that's going to be now, how many people that's going to be in the future. And then that's going to dictate not just how you act, but hopefully, as you build corporate alignment, the whole corporation acts towards this. And if you don't, it will drift towards what's easiest to build, not what's most needed. Data is infrastructure. So no surprise, help seeker data. I did want to present to you the minimum data framework I think that is viable in order to support your plan, your development of your plan, the acceptance of your plan, your advocacy with the provincial government, and transparency of outcomes when you knock on that door and go ask for more money because you're able to show that what you're doing works. You have to track environmental signals, macro trends. That's what Help Seekers for. We can send you those briefs all we want. Take the top part of our presentation. You can convince everyone that this isn't going in the right direction. But the second one that only you can do is the system signals. So how housing and homelessness programs are working. You need 4 things. And I came to this not long ago. I was like, every single time we support a community in social infrastructure planning, in scenario modeling and performance modeling, it's the same 4 pieces. It just looks a little bit different. So supply. You need to know where your supply is across your whole housing and homelessness continuum, your supply of supports and your supply of infrastructure. And you need to know where it is. Ideally, you also know the infrastructure that you don't know or control. So your community partners, non-funded partners are not part of the system. You do need to know how much they own of the system. So for you to be able to estimate what share of the total demand they're going to take. Demand, how many people need housing and supports, at what acuity and where. Performance. Performance is talked about in a kind of a range of ways. I think just as a baseline, if you know what parts of your system are delivering positive exits and stability and which parts are not, either because they're not designed to or because there's something happening within the execution of that program, that's going to give you a huge leg up. And then financials. And it was really interesting doing the kind of municipalities under pressure project with you, because some communities understandably have their financials connected to their program data. So I know I'm funding, $50,000 per bed in supportive housing, and this is how many supportive housing beds I have. Others don't. And I say that with not an ounce of criticism, because connecting this data is the more difficult, but the more valuable thing. So it's not, if you only have limited data resources, spending time on connecting what you have at the minimum base I'm going to show you is often a better return on results than it is collecting more and more. So I'll just go through these. I'm going to give it to you. Give it to your data people if you're lucky to have them. If you're not, call me. Demand, supply per program, your capacity, your occupancy, the number of spaces you're expecting to add, your planned increases, your average length of stay, and your estimated percentage of spaces allocated by acuity level. If you have that, then you can start to compare that to your demand numbers and say, okay, that's great. I can estimate that no one will be forced to live on the streets. We will reduce homelessness by year 7, but actually there's a whole group of people who are very high acuity that I have built no spaces for. So you can see those mismatches of supply demand. And more importantly, you already know it intuitively. You can show it to council, to the province. Performance, positive and negative exit rates, and then financial per program and per intervention, operating and capital costs. You need those. Ideally, you've broken out your program into really specific buckets of what it is you're providing. You don't need to go there though. This is just the baseline of what you might need. And if you don't have some of these things, you can estimate or you can give your best guess. And that's better as a placeholder than just not connecting it at all. Here, with limited resources, connect data, don't collect more data. There's a whole bunch of different things. So I took just the things that I've suggested to you. And if you go through them here, there's a whole bunch of things, then you can test and you can ask your data. It doesn't have to be fancy. And I'm going to give you a non-fancy Excel to do some of this. So what if inflow rises 15% faster than projected? What if we incur significant job losses? How might homelessness be impacted? How many high acuity supportive spaces are needed if I want to meet demand by year 5? What if we emphasize prevention builds instead of and deeply affordable instead of shelter? What's the cost differential of building effective continuum in the north versus the south? What happens if I don't do anything and I don't build anything, but I'm able to get my positive exits up by 10% through different staff training or different policies or improvements to coordinated access? You can ask all of those things and more just with this. I promise you, because we've done them. So the 3 minimum things, and I'm giving this to you in writing in hopes that that it's helpful and you're able to move forward. The 3 plus bonus scenario that I would do that I have seen to be most persuasive to council and most persuasive to other orders of government. How many people are estimated to experience homelessness over the next 10 years if nothing changes? When you say, hey, this is how much our plan costs, and everyone's eyes bulge out of their head, you say, okay, the option is this. And then you can have discussions about whether there's somewhere in between. 2 is stabilization. So what's the minimum we need to do to keep things as they are today? And are we okay with how they are today? And the answer to that is going to be different in each community, depending on what your situation is and your tolerance for people experiencing homelessness and families facing some really, really tough circumstances. And then finally, reduction. So if we're going to spend, what's the difference in cost between reduction and stabilization? And do we want to spend to get back to where we were in 10 years from now? Or do we want to spend to make meaningful progress on this issue? And again, maybe you do want to spend there, but the dollar figure doesn't make sense. I don't believe you can approve targets or even have a discussion about targets until you can have it side by side with those costs. The other one, and I think may be useful in kind of where I can see funding going and expectations of government on data, is how do our outcomes cost change if we improve systems performance across all our programs and housing types by 5%. I just picked 5% for you, but it also shows, hey, we're not forgetting that we need to optimize our system. We've been doing that successfully for years. We're going to continue to do that. We think the appropriate kind of performance or realistic performance adjustment is 5, 10, whatever is in your community. But at the same time, if we don't build spaces for people to go into, we're not going to make progress on this overall. I don't need to show you this. The last thing I'll say, is there are 3 paradigms in which, as a society, and policy-wise that we talk about crisis, and homelessness is specifically vulnerable to this. So humanitarian, logistic, and security. These aren't mutually exclusive, but there always is a dominant one. And you can trace it through the news. I can see it in council discussions. I can even see it in the types of responses and plans we build. We, after COVID, were at the height of a security perspective on homelessness. Our responses, remember, there were very high profile clearings in Ontario and also in Alberta and BC of encampments. That was the height of that. The backlash to that was people saying, okay, this is not right. There was a media turn, there was a public turn. We continued to sort of address encampments and homelessness, but did so more on a logistic basis. With the ruling, the Waterloo ruling on you can't move encampments if there's no safe alternative place to go, it pushed us a little bit more into humanitarian. This is not a sensationalist piece, but I want you to watch very carefully in the US and the language and the news articles about Trump and his clearing of encampments. That does have impact on paradigm shifts and policy discourses in Canada. Our kind of perspective policy is very influenced whether we like it or not. Already yesterday, which is interesting, there was an Ontario mayor declare an emergency, declare a state of emergency on homelessness. I'm not doubting that, and I don't have comment on that. What I do notice is the wording was really specific. It was to reclaim our streets. So you can see that's the first nugget in a while in the news where we've moved a little bit from this logistic humanitarian back into security. I say this because the paradigms in which you develop your plans now will have huge impacts on what you can get approved, what people are willing to do, what people are willing to talk about. But your 10-year plan has to live through all of these. And the best way you can do that is insulate it through data. If you're able to show, hey, this is how many people are experiencing, this is what it's going to cost, here are our options, I promise you it really takes the air out of the room on some of those paradigm and policy pieces, particularly as you get a council late next fall, a new council late next fall. Last thing I'll say, sorry for rushing. You were right, Travis. Help Seeker Modeling Sandbox. So that performance modeling tool, we created one in Excel one day. We have a more complicated one. We have data science things. I wanted one that I just could use, that I could play around with scenarios. And so use the QR code here. You can download it. It should work. Let me know if it doesn't. You can put in your own data. It's just a kind of an Excel with all of these assumptions built in on supply and demand. If you're looking for something more sophisticated, or you want to continue this conversation, please email me. We have done this work with service managers in Ontario, of course, too, following the bigger work we did with you as part of Municipalities Under Pressure. But aside from working with us or not, I do think this tool is useful, at least for you to start to explore. Do we have the data for this? And what might some of the scenarios look like that we could run? Okay, I'm not going to make you keep going. I'm just telling you here it's a good idea. Stopic lenses. So I do want to talk about climate, health, and youth. We're absolutely out of time. We're going to send you a sign up to have a second conversation on some of those more like system level ideas. And I would frankly love to do cameras on, mic on, and talk to you about what you're doing and allow a little bit more of kind of a service manager to service manager sharing. Oh, all right. So I have time for two whopping questions. We have time. I don't know if there are any.
Jesse, I did offer that we could stay around for a little after if folks.
I love that. I just want to be like responsible for people's time, but absolutely.
So we can stay online. This is obviously the end of the webinar, but we can stay and answer questions and have a chat. So if anybody wants to stay, please stay.
Anyone? Questions? Thoughts? Jennifer, yeah, I really appreciate that. There was not this political support to bring that forward. Yeah, it's it's because it's scary, because you put it on paper and also then it turns into a political and public commitment. One way I think us talking about money can be through scenarios, and it's not, okay, here's our costed plan, But here are like any business operations and modeling we do across municipalities and DSABs is here are the different scenarios, which one is most palatable to you? And if it's not financially palatable, then you have to look at it and say that you're okay that we're going to see a 30% increase in homelessness. But to totally understand your point. Questions. Ontario's new revised legislation, yes, Safer Municipalities Act, I'm just looking at Jennifer's, are already shifting the homelessness response towards enforcement, move along, fines, etc. Yes, exactly. That you're totally right. So that was a signal. The heart hubs were sort of a signal, closing the SCSs, the heart hubs were sort of a signal to security. I was interested to see that letter that the minister sent, though. I was expecting it to be more security based on kind of what I had seen. So it's interesting that they kind of balanced it back out, but that's not to say that there won't be some of that focus, or should be, over the coming years. But the plan really has to try to, I believe, for it to be effective, insulate itself from all of the swings. Is there any clarity on what the federal government will do across the country for a housing plan? No, but someone sent to me, this is so interesting. Someone sent to me an internal posting that the feds had put up, job posting. And basically this person is intended to figure out what they were going to do with all the housing needs assessments that have been done and what the next steps are on that. And so it wasn't an externally posted, but to me it signals that they have something in the works, but who knows? Any other questions or comments? I don't want to hold you here if nothing, but another message here. Thank you so much for coming. Okay.